Hi, I'm Mike. I interview a tennis friend. He's also a fictional writer. His name is Dr. Swan. So this video is, should you write a book? Should you start one? This writer, Dr. Swan, I asked him questions about writing and starting a book because he's written 19 fictional books. He's on his 20th book right now. He's halfway from writing it. Dr. Swan is a self-publisher on Amazon. And I've read his book, one of his 19 books. It's Artifact, book 1. I'll grab it right now. It's this one. The book is about an egg-shaped artifact. A professor finds it underground. He was digging and he found it. Something precious. His job is to give it to the government before anyone else grabs it, because there's something about that artifact. And I'll just leave it there. I don't want to spoil it for you. During this interview, halfway from the interview, my arm was getting tired holding the camera. It lowers and you just see here, all you do is just read his lips. I'm sorry about that. I did not come prepared with a tripod, but I'll be ready for the next vlog for that, because I didn't expect it was gonna be a long interview. I always gotta come prepared, and I did enjoy the interview. I learned something. All right, enough of the talking. Let's watch this interview with Dr. Swan on the tennis court. I'll be playing tennis with this writer, Dr. Swan. He's been writing books. I'm gonna interview him. I got 5 questions lined up and maybe 5 more questions at the top of my head.
Hello.
How many books have you written so far?
So I've written 19 books and I'm working on number 20 right now.
Motivation doesn't last forever. Are you able to stay disciplined in writing books to this day?
Well, when I started about 10 years ago, I didn't really know exactly how it was gonna go. The magic of writing books is that you get inspiration that you don't expect. So a lot of times I'll start a book without having any ending to the book. I'll have a story that I want and a scenario and some characters, but I don't really have the ending. The ending appears as if by magic. And that's one of the things about writing a book, and probably the whole creative process, that has kept me doing it. That moment of magic when something you didn't consider enters into the story, or a direction, or an ending, it's pretty special. A very worthwhile thing when it happens.
What do you mean by magic?
Writers call it the muse. It's like the story comes from outside of you. You had no idea where a particular story was going, and you'll get an idea that seems like it was not something that was even in your mind. This happens in a lot of different ways in the course of writing a book. It can be small things like dialogue, particular twist that happens in a story. In general, sometimes it feels like it isn't from you, like it's coming from outside, and that's kind of the magic of that thing that happens when you're writing.
So you call it the beauty of writing?
I do. I feel that. It's why whenever I'm talking to anybody, I encourage them to write if they haven't done it, or if they have a story or partial story in their head, or a story that they think they would like to read. I try to encourage them to give it a try, to go out there and write it. It's a really great experience.
And when did you want to write a book? How long was that time frame?
I bet it took me, it was less than a year from the time I had an inspiration to write a book to the time I actually wrote it. I was embarrassed to try it. I was already retired and in my early 50s. I love novels. I love to get a novel that captivates me, where the characters captivate me, the ideas and the plot. To actually sit down and write it was a whole nother thing. And that doesn't even include the fact that I was 40 years removed from school and had to bone up on my grammar. I have to admit, I started the book. It was fun and interesting, but it was really bad. It was bad. It was bad in a lot of ways. The grammar was bad, storyline was bad, and the characters were bad. That first book I probably ended up writing, I would say 100 times, over and over again, trying to get it right. I dumped my original characters, sort of interestingly adopted people around me to use in the story. I have a special needs son. He's prominent in the book. What I found was that writing the book was very cathartic, because it allowed me to say things about raising a special needs child that were thoughts but never really expressed. Doing something like that is always helpful. That became something that became sort of the background of the story, but not the story itself.
The characters you write about in your fictional books, it's about people in your lives. Your son is one of them.
Not always, though. Sometimes it's characters, they could be characters from movies or other books that are types of people, not the exact people themselves. You always have to be cautious if you put somebody you know in a book and they can tell. They can misread it, because a lot of times you're using their personality types or their attributes as opposed to it actually being them. For instance, said I used my son Ryan. The picture of a character in my book was more like the child who was in the movie The Sixth Sense. What ends up happening is that the character is fictional, but there are attributes that you take from people in books. The main female character in that book, whose name is Shannon, has attributes from people that I know, and her eyes are definitely my wife's eyes. The most beautiful eyes I've ever seen.
I see eyes. When I look in a woman, I go for their eyes. You met your wife. They never age unless you ever get cataracts.
Yeah. Well, most characters are kind of a mishmash. The main character in the book, Dennis, is me in a lot of ways. It's how I think. He doesn't look like me. In my head, he looks like Tom Hanks. In his way of thinking and his attributes and some of the stuff that he's doing in the book, part of the backstory makes him sort of a full character, is mostly me. I've never written a book before. I had to sort of cheat in order to keep the characters vivid in my mind, and that's why I drew from some of the people that I know, people like things like that.
Just changing angles now. What motivated or inspired you to write books?
It may be the love of that medium. There are several books that sort of live in me that I had read, really like the Outlander novels. A couple of books by Dean Koontz, Fear Nothing and Seize the Night, were just books that I don't know why the characters and the story just kind of lived in me. I tend to like books that have some supernatural aspects. So they're not just a love story or maybe a political book. They tend to have a sort of a supernatural or science fiction aspect. Those are the kind of things that draw me. There's a couple of Stephen King books also that just kind of do that to you. They take you out of your natural world and sort of expand it into dimensions or ghosts or aliens or whatever. Those are the kind of books that kind of stick with me, the ones I really like. When I decided to write the first book, it was actually a story that sort of began and appeared as a ghost story, but then finished as a book that was about encountering creatures from another dimension. And that was thought about the book was that maybe ghosts or other things that we encounter that are supernatural really are just other dimensions sort of leaking in. That really was the story.
When did you love to read? You love to read, you just said it, and then it made you inspired to be a writer.
Right. Yeah, that didn't start, well, it started for me probably when I was around 12, I would say.
Oh, that's a young age. Because when I was your age, I hated reading.
I hated reading also when I was forced to read something I didn't want to read. But a friend of mine was into the Conan novels by Robert E. Howard. Those books, again, as a 12 and 13-year-old, were books that just captured my imagination. There was swords and sorcerers and creatures and all those things that 12 and 13-year-old boys love, and packaged in a way that was really well written.
The imagination, creativity in writing.
Yep. Actual writing, the style and the way the stories moved and those types of things that made the story really come alive in my mind. So I would say that that was when I figured that I loved writing. The thing is, after that, and when I got into my late teens and 20s, I really didn't read very much, in 30s even. I was just too busy, too tired. You'd read 3 pages and fall asleep. Fortunately, ended up on a night crew at Safeway. Night crew is a terrible experience. It's unbearable, boring, fatigue. It's hard to even sort of capture in words, but I began getting audiobooks just to get me through the night, and found that type of storytelling just sort of enthralled me. And so I started getting audiobooks all the time. If I had a project, a house, I would have an audiobook. Found that those types of really great stories and really great readers, I have to admit, made me more interested in novels again. And then I began reading and getting more audiobooks, and as I retired, decided to give writing a try.
Going back to people you write about in your books, and then you think, or you believe, or maybe assume that they read it and they might think, oh, D.R. Swan is talking about me in the book.
Right.
But you would use a different name, would you? There's a lot of people in this world.
You can find yourself. Some people I think could probably find themselves in the books, but generally it isn't them. It's something I admire about them, usually in attributes, almost never describe the same. Their physical description would always be different. The name would always be different. But there would be attributes or things or settings that might lead them to think that they were the person in the book, but the reality of it is that it's just a mishmash. Some of the people in the first book, and I wrote wrote 7 books in that series, so it's basically the same people. The inspiration for that character is usually from several different places and not just from the person. But I'll like certain things about him. I have a friend who appears in the series. He was a computer geek, like a real hacker computer guy. He became part of the story. The name was changed. This guy became a really interesting character for me in the book. He might read it and sort of figure it was him or figure someone like him. Again, the names were changed, so he'd be speculating. Anyone would be speculating whether or not it was them.
And you said you've written 20 books, right, so far?
I'm in the middle of the 20th book right now.
What makes you just want to continue writing and writing? Because you're on your 20th book.
Yeah, every time.
Like grind in the process.
Every time it's been a separate inspiration. So I write some series. The Sideways series is my first series. That series, I'm writing the 8th book right now. That series began in one way. I've written my most popular book, which is called Artifact.
Yeah, I read your first series, right?
That had another inspiration. It was basically a thought, like a puzzle in your head. I thought to myself, this could be a book. But I have to admit that I've started books and just stopped because I knew I could never get a full book out of them. That's how I probably have 10 books just
unpublished books.
Yeah, they're
just there.
Well, there's stories
unpublished,
and
unreleased.
Yeah, stories and ideas that have been set aside, never really followed through with because I didn't really feel I was going to get an entire book out of it. Book is somewhere between 50 and 100,000 words. Got to have a pretty good story. Got to have a pretty good storyline. You need to have some twists. That's a whole nother subject about writing, about how all that comes together to be a book. Some of the magic that I had mentioned before didn't happen while I was sort of beginning these books. So they just end up either shelved for a time until something else happens that spurs me, or they might just lead to another idea. Had just finished Zombie series, was never a big fan of that genre, had an idea about how the story might begin, how the sort of infection that causes this to happen might occur, became excited by the scenario. I had a sort of a Jason Bourne kind of character in mind for one of the main characters.
I gotta read that. I love Jason Bourne movies, the Matt Damon movies.
Yeah, they're great movies. And you end up where some of the story just kind of writes itself. And then that's the magic that I had mentioned. Sometimes it feels like I'm being dictated to. Like it's not even coming out of my head, but it's coming from outside and into my fingers while I'm typing. It's pretty special when that happens. Why I do recommend anybody who has an idea for a story to give it a try. Because I'm self-published, Amazon provides accessible ways to self-publish and not go through traditional publishers. It's almost impossible to go through a traditional publisher, especially if you are not the greatest writer. 1/10 of 1/4 of 1% publishers are the agents pick up.
Amazon welcomes any writer, anyone.
Do.
Okay.
They do. Sold over 43,000 books as a result of Amazon and advertising through Facebook. Those two things have...
The self-published writer,
As
Amazon.
a self-published writer. Everybody wants to be published. Not everybody can. Amazon gets 100,000 books a month, and you're competing with that. So
You did tell me competition's everywhere. I have a friend. He's almost done writing a book about a pro baseball player, a retired. He's still looking for the big name publishers. I feel like they're gonna find someone else better. Or he does have a good storyline, but competition everywhere. Just got to keep pitching. Or there's another word for it. You said he writes a letter. It's not a pitch letter.
it's called a query letter.
There, query letter.
Right. You pitch it to agents.
Or
And
agents, which he has.
Agents will pitch it to the publisher. If your friend has been picked up by an agent already, that's a good sign. That gives him a chance to be published. I've written probably 50 query letters and not been picked up by an agent, to probably a couple dozen of agents. Gotten some decent responses, but the fact of the matter is that they are very specific about what they're looking for at the time, and sometimes they're just full. They've got all the writers that they need, and they just are not taking new writers at the time. It is difficult to become published traditionally. It can happen. People can do it. There's people who are self-published. The guy who wrote The Martian, he was self-published and ended up hitting it pretty big. The book's wonderful. But there are a lot of good independent writers out there too. That's become my niche.
For my friend who's been taking a while to write a book, been maybe already more than 6 years, because he's trying to go for the perfect book. But once it's published, things probably won't go his way. You don't know. Who knows? Time will tell. What if he fails? And then he put all the time, work, and effort on that book. As long as you publish it, you'll never know unless you try. At least publish it so you won't regret it later in the future.
Exactly. My advice to him would be, because I kind of get the impression he hasn't actually finished the book yet. His publisher or his agent is waiting for that book to be done. They will not push a book that isn't completely finished and edited and ready to go. That's kind of, even though the agent has agreed to represent him, that agent is waiting for the final manuscript.
I see.
He needs to finish the book before they will push it out to anybody, because people flake. He may not finish the book, and an agent isn't going to finish the book for him. He's got to get it done in order for anybody to, somebody already likes the idea, and somebody already likes the book, and someone already likes the writing, or they would have let that go. They would have said, sorry, I've got other stuff going. Good luck. Good luck out there. He needs to finish the book, and that would be my advice to him. Get it done. And he could, if a publisher will not pick it up, he could publish it himself on Amazon, which is what I've done. You need to market them yourself. And if you get a publisher, they do all that for you.
Yeah.
You know, they'll do the final editing. They usually have two different editors, an editor who do storyline and then a line editor who will just do grammar or flow. You need to get the manuscript pretty much perfect the way you would want it. Otherwise, they just won't push it forward. What's difficult about being on Amazon is separating yourself from everyone else. There's millions of books, probably millions of authors. You know, they get a huge amount every month. You have to do a degree of marketing in order to get your book forward in people's
Promoting,
eyes.
marketing, and advertising.
That is difficult. I don't take any credit for that myself. My son is the one who does my marketing out of the goodness of his heart. And it's been fun and a way for us to kind of be close and share some stuff.
Oh yeah, father and son, bonding time.
If it wasn't for his marketing, I wouldn't have sold nearly as many books as I've sold. And I've sold books worldwide. I've sold books in Japan, in Brazil, continent of Europe. Most of the books that I sell are Great Britain, Australia, and Canada. Canada, not as much. A little harder to reach them. Don't really know why. Great Britain has been probably a third of my sales. That's one thing nice about Facebook, is that you reach across boundaries. That's a good thing. It's allowed me to sort of expand out there a little bit into the world. It's hard to find those people who will read your book. You have to do something in your marketing that's a little bit special in order to get them to look at the book. In my case, my son has made short videos, sort of talk about what the story's about, different graphics.
Oh, so it's like a trailer, like a movie trailer,
Exactly,
or movie
like
teaser.
A movie trailer. And that, you know, that's been what has picked up my sales over somebody who has just as good of a story, just as good of a writer, isn't selling nearly as many books. Difference is marketing.
Then as of now, do you listen to your audience? Do you understand your audience? Do you know who your fans are? And once you know that you're fans, then you write the same books.
Yeah, I don't do that.
You try to go
Yeah.
with what your fans want, or
don't.
you just go
Yeah,
with
I
your
don't do
mood,
that.
like what you feel like writing about.
That's what I do.
Right.
I do in zombie series, which is called the Z Plague series. I had trouble sort of finishing those books because although I really love the story and I love the characters, I wasn't a huge fan of the genre, and so I found it more difficult to finish those books than some of the other books that I had finished. The books were good. I liked the books. I liked the story. I love the way they turned out. Poured hundreds of hours into them. If I don't really write something that I like or that's really resonating with me,
That you love and enjoy.
then I end up becoming kind of lazy about it, and it's sitting down to write becomes more difficult. The book that I'm writing now, which is the 8th book in the Sideways series, is being written so easily because of the genre and the characters. I will say with every book though, it is different. It's hard to sort of overgeneralize. One of my favorite books is probably one of my least successful. Haven't even sold 100 copies of it. It's about an 11-year-old girl who saves the world. It's written, I wrote it originally towards maybe 7th graders, 8th graders, that age group. I didn't dumb it down, but it was kind of written towards them. I love the story. The story came to me in a flash from beginning to end. Again, it was kind of that magic that I talked about before.
Yeah.
Story just appeared in a way that I really can't describe. And it wrote itself very easily. I'm almost 90,000 words, and I finished that thing probably before 3 months. That's pretty fast to finish a first draft of a story that's 90,000 words.
What's your average time each book to finish?
It varies. I say my average time is probably over 3 months. for the first draft. And that doesn't include editing and rewriting and all that other stuff that takes another at least 2 months.
Then how many drafts is the final draft? So you're on the first
You know, it
draft,
depends.
and then
Yeah, it depends. Everyone's different. But as I've gotten more proficient at writing and my style has improved and my turning of phrase has improved and my ability to describe settings and scenes has improved, the rewriting takes less time
I see.
than first draft. The first draft actually probably has most chapters rewritten 5 times maybe. By the time it's a first draft, it's already been rewritten quite a few times. But you miss things and you repeat yourself and you find sort of inconsistencies. Those things have to be sort of corrected because people who are reading, they catch those things.
Oh yeah, they spot that.
They spot that. And then you just kind of look like an idiot instead
That's
of a
all right.
writer.
No one's perfect, right?
Yeah,
We
well,
live in an
that's why you
imperfect
have to.
world.
That's why you do have to kind of keep going over your book
Oh, yeah.
and
Keep
rereading,
double
it,
checking,
and
triple
rewriting.
checking.
Yeah, those things will kind of happen in your head. Like you'll say, "Geez, I think I said that over here," and then you go back and basically while I'm editing, I listen to the book using text to speech. That's a big help too because your ears catch things that your eyes don't see and that your
Oh,
brain
yeah.
doesn't see connected to
More
your
senses
eyes. It sort of
functioning.
Yeah, hearing it does connect it to a different part of your brain that helps with flow and editing, anything that might be repetitive, that kind of stuff. So,
Are you a better writer since day one?
oh yeah,
To the point you believe the more you write, the more you work on your craft.
No
But that's for
question.
everything in life too. Just continue to work on your craft and eventually you'll get better.
everything's like that except for tennis. That
Yeah, we
writing,
should start playing.
that writing, that writing is probably the thing that improves the most over time, I would say.
When you first writed your book or the rest of your other books, does it get in your head to the point, okay, I want to write perfect book, to the point I want it to be like a big hit book, or just write the book and you're already happy enough you at least touch one person
Right.
or 10 people or one person that loved the book? Would you choose that or go for the hit book before you publish it?
Well, I think every time you write a book, you think it's a hit book. There's so much work involved and you like the story because you've invested the time to think about it. Those stories that I put aside, stories and ideas that I liked but didn't think I could get a book out of. On Amazon, there's this thing where it's like a blog for writers. Find that the new writers, the new people on there, they think that their book is going to be the greatest book ever written. So everybody kind of thinks that when they write their book.
That's a mindset. You think that too, or the mind talks
has to
before
be.
you write a book.
Well, it has
you got
to.
confidence.
Yeah, it has to be the mindset. You would never invest the time and energy to write a book or finish a book without thinking that the book really had a chance to go somewhere.
How do you feel when it's not a hit book?
Yeah, it's I won't say it's completely disheartening. Generally, I'm satisfied with the book. Maybe I'm rationalizing, but I think it's more being able to find that right audience. The whole thing that matters about finding an audience is marketing. And it takes as much energy as the writing of the book. So you can't dismiss it. These people who write these books and do think that they are really good books, they may be right, but they're just not reaching the audience. Or they're not the tiny percentage of people who get picked up by an agent and then end up published. That's a whole different crowd. I won't say necessarily their stories are better. I've read traditionally published books. I will say generally their editing is probably better than most independent writers because they have professional editors, and hiring a professional editor is really expensive, and they still don't catch everything. For me to write a book and not have it read by a lot of people isn't as difficult as you might think. Now, if I wrote a book, thought it was good, and it just got smashed by reviews and people just hated it, that would be a different story, but I haven't had that. Most of my books, good reviews, even if only a few.
Oh, so far so good.
Yeah, but I have over 3,000 reviews between Amazon and Goodreads, and those reviews are generally over 4 stars for most of my books. But then there's a few books where they're under 4 stars, maybe like 3.8, 3.9. And a lot of times that happens because there is some subject matter in the book people find not to their liking.
I see.
And it could be political statements, it could be sex. Sex is something that you have to be really careful about in your book, depending on the genre. Science fiction, you can't have very much, maybe only a tiny bit. If you're writing a romance, you have to have quite a bit. about the book becoming erotica, which kind of pushes it into a different category. But erotica is basically a lot of sex and no story, or little story, where romance is some sex but really good story to go along with this. There is subject matter that where people will one-star you because they didn't like the fact that it showed up in the book.
Someone's always going to have something to say.
Yeah.
Haters are always going to hate, and it's impossible to please everyone.
Well, and kind of the point is that if you're not pissing somebody off, you're probably not doing your job as a writer. You know, you have to take chances. You have to be different.
Take a risk, what you have.
You've got to take risks. You've got to go out there. You got to put yourself out there. Sometimes people will say stuff that hurts you. It's no question about it. Sometimes people will say stuff that you didn't think about and that will cause you, it's actually caused me to go back and do a few rewrites because of certain reviews where people have said something that has spurred me to go back and rewrite something. It may be something I've toned down. People are kind of strange about sex though, because if I were to dismember somebody in my book, they wouldn't care. The fact that they are engaged in some sex, they recoil at it. There are things in the world that you have to be cautious about when you write.
Oh yeah, be mindful about it.
And that makes sense.
Let's say you got the worst book of all time. Would you choose that, or choose not to write a book ever in your life?
I would write the worst book. Writing was that much of a positive experience. And that's kind of why I would always encourage somebody to try it.
You'll never know unless you try.
I think generally, worst book would be maybe something that people probably would not read, but there are some people who would read it. And there are some people who would like it because they think like you. When you start to build up a little bit of a fan base, that's kind of the point. You're reaching people who kind of think like you. There are people out there who don't think like me or have different morals, different ideas about society. They probably are not going to like my book. As a matter of fact, a lot of them make comments about it. I've had some pretty serious one-star reviews, thought that what I wrote was garbage. It's just kind of the way it goes. You're out there, you're exposing yourself to everybody on the planet. They're rejecting you because they're not buying your book, and they're rejecting you because they read your book and gave it a 1 or 2 star review or call it mediocre or whatever. But then you have the people who really loved it, and those are the people who kind of think like you, and so they will tend to follow you. They'll tend to look for your next book because they like not only what you say but the way you say it.
Oh yeah, looking forward to the next book.
Yeah, so that
touches your heart.
And that's a positive part. I will say though that as a writer you really need to write for yourself and not write for people or fans or expectations, because those kinds of books never end up in a way where you're satisfied with them. It will stop you from writing the next book. It has to be those things from inside you that come out. Those are the things that you want to appear in a book, even if they piss people off. That's just kind of the way it goes.
You have a love relationship in writing.
Yes.
How about a hate relationship?
Yes.
What's your hate relationship in writing? So now you have a love-hate in writing.
Yes.
All right, what's the hate?
That's there too. Well, sometimes you'll hit sticking points. Sit down to write, it's just not there. I'll have days where I sit down to write, everything I write's garbage. Writing, deleting, just not happening. The ideas, the writing is crappy. Where I took the story I didn't like, and then there's editing. I've gotten better at it. I use Grammarly, I admit that. Have to edit for flow, and it ends up being quite a challenge. Writing is fun and interesting. I've had to do a huge amount of research in some of the books, particularly the science fiction books. And that's kind of fun too, because you learn stuff you didn't know. There's a lot of work involved.
What are the steps of writing? Brainstorming, researching, writing, and editing.
So the most important thing for me to start a book is to have a good scenario and characters that I've already kind of fallen in love with. That takes a while. It's harder in the earlier books and why I sort of cheated and used more of the people I knew.
Before you write a book, you have the characters, about each character, their personality, right?
Their personality, what they look like, what they think. The first thing I think is the scenario, and then the characters.
Got it.
Have an idea about a story that you think you would like to read, of a story that you think should have been in a book at some point you never encountered.
So having like a short story, like with its climax, and then the characters, and then you start writing the book.
Actually, I rarely write a book with the climax. I almost never have the ending of the book because I don't know where the book's going to end.
So you just surprise yourself while you're writing.
Exactly, and that's part of the fun. That's part of the fun. It's allowing yourself to read and enjoy the book at the same time you're writing it. Even Stephen King rarely writes with an ending. He picks a scenario and begins.
He wrote a really wonderful book called On Writing, which is a nonfiction about his thinking about writing. It's one of my favorite books on just writing and writing the path that you end up on as a writer.
The journey.
It's a very good book.
So you must love Stephen King.
No, he goes places where I don't really like to go as much.
Do you love his writing?
I like the way he writes. I like a lot of his books, but some of his books I'll start and then I won't continue. That kind of happens with everybody, and I know that happens with a lot of people with my books, is that it just doesn't grab them. Subject matter is kind of crunchy.
And that's all right.
And that's okay for a lot of people. For me, sometimes I'll hit something that I don't like and I just won't finish the book. I mean, you only have so many hours in the day. If you're not grabbed, and that's why anyone who starts one of my books and doesn't like it or just doesn't grab them, that's fine. That's good. That's the way it is. That's the way writing is. That's something you just have to accept as part of the deal, because it's something that you do as a reader.
My friend is an actor, and he would say that too. Like, if he watches movies and he's just not feeling it, the first 10 minutes it's boring, he just doesn't want to watch it. He'll just walk away from the movie theaters.
There are some things about writing that are kind of having to do with that type of craft. They say to put something exciting right up front and then get more into the story. There are parts of a book that are called saggy middles, where it starts off sort of exciting but then sags in the middle so much that it becomes boring and that people put it down because it takes you too long to get back.
So it could be slow, the transition.
So
slow at first, and then it's waiting, and then people could just say, I'll stop reading, or I'll just continue reading. Hopefully it's going to get faster.
Exactly. One of the most important things about becoming a fiction writer is the ability to storytell. And I do think that isn't really something necessarily learned. It may be, but I think it's more something that's inside some people. Some people are sort of natural storytellers. I felt that as a beginning writer, that I was a decent storyteller, but a crappy writer. Working on the craft didn't hamper, but enhanced my ability to storytell. Totally had to work hard to become a better writer. That was a journey. I've rewritten every one of my books in the last 2 years just because of my ability to be a better storyteller.
You go for tone of voice. Your reader or your fan or audience is reading your book. While they're reading, they could hear your tone of voice. Do you want that?
I don't do that for them.
You're not for a tone of voice. You're more just, just storytell and write.
Yeah, because every story is kind of different. I mean, I've written stories in the vampire genre, stories in the sort of ghost science fiction genre, and stories in the hard science fiction, and then in the zombie, and then I've written a couple of kids books that are basically geared towards kids. Every story is different. I don't want to sound like the same writer in every story, but I want a certain type of quality, because every genre is different. Your voice as a writer, I think, has to adjust somewhat with it, especially if you write in different genres. Some writers just write in one genre.
Like a change, yeah.
And they don't change.
Voice.
They write the same kind of book all the time. For them, probably keeping that same thing, that tone or cadence or something expected, that's probably better for them in that situation. For me, I think there are some changes. I can tell when I'm going back and sort of rereading portions of the books over time. They are written somewhat different style, I would say.
This is the last question now.
Okay.
So for someone that's indecisive, hesitant about, like, should I write a book? Should they write a book?
They should. I'll tell them what to do, exactly what to do. Set up a folder on their computer, put up a Word document, and write notes on it. In that document, start putting down ideas about your book. Maybe it could be characters, it could be a short scene, it could be a little synopsis about what you'd kind of like to be in the book, and then ideas for different chapters, and just do bullet point notes all the way down that page until you think you have your story, and then begin writing it. And I think you'll find that you can finish that book. Not saying it's going to be great, not saying it's going to be exactly what you wanted, but I think you'll find that it was worth the effort in a lot of ways. That would be my advice.
All right, so that's a wrap. Thank you, Dr. Swan, for taking the time for this interview. Now we should play tennis.
Let's hit some tennis balls, Mike.
Forgot the last words. We need more people like you.
Thank you.
Keep writing.